Okay. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Amber Datta. Dr. Amber Datta is a social scientist from Hawai'i Island focused on the challenges of collaborative environmental governance in the context of rapid social and environmental change. She recently stepped into the role of Nearshore Oceans Program Officer at the Harold K. L. Castle Foundation, responsible for leading the foundation's marine strategy. Dr. Datta's research and practice focuses on developing inclusive governance processes that support community-led stewardship, adaptive action, and the interweaving of diverse knowledge into marine resource decisions. She holds an MS in International Conservation and Development, as well as a graduate certificate in Natural Resource Conflict Resolution from the University of Montana. She received her PhD in Conservation Science, jointly awarded by James Cook University and the University of Montana. She has had the privilege of working on nearshore fisheries and coral reef management issues in the Solomon Islands, the Great Barrier Reef region, and Hawaii.
Thank you for the kind introduction and hello, everyone. Sorry. All right. So today I'm going to share a little bit about postdoctoral research that I completed in June of this year. It was a 2-year project, a highly applied research project. And I'm happy to talk with you afterwards about both the project and the process of doing collaborative research, because it was a very involved project, but I really enjoyed it. And just a little bit of context. So this is Kona now and South Kona, which is where I was born and raised. And some of my work was done here for this research and also across the islands. And I had a lot more introduction, but that was a great introduction, so I'm going to leave it at that. So I'm curious, for those in the room, how many of you are in the marine and nearshore space? If you could raise your hand. And then how many are more terrestrial Malca spaces? Okay, so I'm going to try to balance the nearshore fisheries intro information with some more details for those of you who know it. So climate change and other anthropogenic stressors are accelerating change in coral reefs and nearshore fisheries around the world, including in Hawaii. Our nearshore fisheries are important for ecological reasons, but also for social and cultural and subsistence reasons here. So there's both a social and ecological dimension to these systems, and both are important for navigating climate change effectively. See if I can change my slide. So bringing us to the context of Hawaii, there is a lot that needs to be done to improve our management of nearshore fisheries, including a collaborative approach led by communities and by government, ideally in a happy collaboration, although it has been challenging at times. I just want to check. So in order to promote a more flexible and adaptive approach in the face of climate change, there has been a movement towards really locally place-based marine resource management across the islands, led by communities of place. And this sits in a context of Hawaii being part of the Pacific, in addition to being part of the US. And so what this looks like in the modern day context is communities collaborating with government to create a marine area and then pass rules for those areas. So these are things like bag limits or size limits or spawning area closures. And it's been a long journey to do this. It's been about 2 decades of work. Once these areas are passed, it's a huge success for that community and for the governments that are working with them. But there's still more that needs to be done. So the rules, once they go into place, tend to be a bit stagnant. So for example, if you create a bag limit of 5 for uhu or whatever kind of species the community cares about, if something happens to that population or there's a bleaching event or the population does well and increases, it's really hard to change those rules. So this project is very focused on how do we get into that rulemaking process and make the rules themselves more flexible and adaptive. So, and just to put us in place, this is Maunalua Bay. This is the most recently created fishery management area. We also have 2 community-based subsistence fishing areas, actually 3 in the state, but 2 up here, 1 on Hawai'i and 1 on Big Island. So this is really a statewide effort. So we know that we need to be flexible and agile in the face of climate change impacts. But we also know that this is challenging in democratic systems, and I want to unpack a little bit about why this is challenging. So in a democratic system, whenever we make a rule that affects all of the public has an opportunity to weigh in on what those rules should be. And this is defined in every state's Administrative Procedures Act, which sounds like the most boring piece of legislation you could think of. It is actually really important because it's what allows government to be transparent, or in this case, communities and government working together as they put a rule forward. So it dictates things like when there should be public hearings, when there's time for testimony. And it's the same across all agencies. And that's really important because it's kind of just one process, whether it's health or education or environment. And therefore, it's not super well suited to environmental change. So these rules and these processes are designed to make society stable, which is good. They're designed to make participation possible, which is also important. But there's limitations when you're trying to be nimble and shift with shifts in coral reef systems. I'm curious, just in passing, if any of you have heard of Chapter 91 in Hawaii. Especially those of you who have worked with the state are familiar with it. So Chapter 91 is what people will say kind of in common language here. It means the Administrative Procedures Act. Every state has one, and the federal government has one as well. So moving back into the fisheries situation, what we have is a mismatch between how our social system is designed and how our ecosystems are changing. And to make this tangible, just as one example, and there are many, moi is a super popular food fish across the islands. It has a close period written into the state rules, but we know from observation and from the observation of many fishers that these moi are often spawning outside of their closure window. So that means they're not actually being protected when they need to be, and there's a need for adaptive action there, but that's a lot easier to say than it is to do. So this project was designed to try to help solve those kinds of conundrums. Stepping back from fisheries, this is a challenge across environmental management. And so there's been literature and past research specifically at the intersection of environmental governance scholarship and legal scholarship, like full-on law review level scholarship, to try to look at how we could rewrite those Administrative Procedures Act to better reflect environmental change and be more flexible through rulemaking. That's a very good endeavor to do. We need that kind of idealistic, this is how legislation could be built differently. We also need to be able to move now with the systems that we have. And so this work is really focused on, okay, we know what could be, but what are the opportunities and limits that we have amongst our available legal tools in order to support collaborative adaptive management tomorrow or 2 years from now, and not 10 or more years from now when we figure out how to rewrite or adjust those legislation, if ever. So just to put this case in context, what this conversation looks like right now in practice, there is a shared interest in adaptive management. If you talk to government officials or to community or to NGOs here, you will hear a lot of positive, yes, we should do this, yes, we need this. So that means there's some momentum to try to develop this approach, but everyone's coming into rulemaking and encountering barriers when they try to realize it in practice. And it's easy to say, yes, we want to do adaptive management, and it's a different thing to figure out what people actually mean by that. So when a community leader says they want to do adaptive management in their place, that might be very different than what a researcher means or what a government official means. Most recently, there is a new law here called an adaptive management law. So just setting the policy context, we have that Administrative Procedures Act already, but we also have an adaptive management law that allows the state to take an action that lasts for only 2 years. So rather than saying, okay, this rule's in place and it's there forever, that rule goes into place and after 2 years, it disappears for better or for worse. So there's a new opportunity here. The state has tested it once. There might be more opportunities to test it in other ways. And there also might be some other ways to use our Chapter 91 process differently or to use emergency rulemaking. So you've probably heard of governors or leaders declaring emergencies for society in general, usually in response to a disaster. There is sort of an environmental equivalent to that. If a species looks like it's going to really crash, you can call for emergency rulemaking, and this lets the state move really quickly, but whatever it does only lasts for 6 months. So you can see there's a pattern there. The quicker it is to put a rule in place, the shorter the period is that it lasts. And so there's only one example of using that emergency rulemaking so far, which I will talk about. So this project was big. It was a 2-year project. There were a lot of research questions and objectives. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I want to orient you to the full scope of the project and then dig in on a few pieces. So the first research question is, what are the hopes, ideas, concerns for adaptive fisheries management held by fisheries actors from across sectors and islands? So the objective there was to really assess fisheries actors' expectations, hopes, and concerns related to adaptive fisheries management, and to provide recommendations tailored to the specific needs of Hawaii. So here is the part that is really on the ground, talking to communities, talking to NGOs, talking to government officials, and government staff to figure out, okay, what do you actually mean when you say adaptive management, and how do we start to action that? We then went to what are the strengths and limitations of existing rulemaking processes for supporting adaptive actions to manage nearshore fisheries. So we have those 3 rulemaking opportunities. When is one useful versus another to try to realize some of the different hopes that communities or others are bringing up? So the first is to identify those rulemaking processes. That's a policy analysis. And then to articulate the lessons learned from previous rulemaking processes. And then lastly, how can rulemaking processes better support adaptive action? How do we do better in the future? So I did actually a bit of a policy comparison to other states. I won't talk about that today because it's a lot. But I do want to go over some of the next steps that we found through the research. So today I'll just talk about these 3 objectives. And if you really like this information and you want to learn more, you can read the full report. So moving into methods, so this is a qualitative research project. It was case studies and interviews. It was done in collaboration with the Hawaii Division of Aquatic Resources and with Kua and Ulu Awamo, which is a grassroots network of communities that do this work across all the islands. So what does fisheries actors mean in this case? So the work started with 45 conversations, talk stories across the islands and across sectors. This was, again, government, NGO, community groups, and researchers, because researchers are actually players in this space as well. And then there are 2 case studies that I'll briefly go through, kind of sub cases of each of the 2 rulemaking processes that are less used. And how many in the room have done qualitative research or interviews before? A few of you. Okay. Well, I'll give you the basics. So these are hour-long conversations. Some people like to talk longer, so some of them went to 2 hours, especially if they were involved in a lot of previous rulemaking. It was a stratified sample, so I was trying to talk to people across all the islands and across all those different sectors that I mentioned. And the idea is to get a really diverse range of perspectives on these issues. I offered confidentiality, so that means that I don't release the names of the people I talked to unless they wanted me to. So they had an option to be quoted directly if they wanted to. And that's just to give them credit for their ideas if they want credit. So after the informal talk stories, that was kind of just a step 1. Is this the right direction to go with the project? I did around 41 interviews in the end that were more formal. There was also a public comment review. So in rulemaking, there is the periods where the public can give testimony or comment back to the government, and that is all recorded, and it's something that you can analyze when you do this kind of research. So I had 2 students that were helping with that, and then a legal intern to help with the policy review. So this is just a summary of who I ended up talking to. So there was a relatively good balance across mostly state government, NGO, and community stewardship groups, as well as members of fishery advisory groups. So these are fishers or others who advise or provide comment to the state on the direction they might go on fisheries management. And then there were a few researchers or those with a university affiliation. And just so you can see this by island, so there were group or individual interviews. So some communities prefer to be interviewed as a small group rather than as an individual. So both of those types of interviews are included in this count. And the idea was to represent proportionally the number of efforts that are happening across different islands. So you can see that there's a lot happening on Oahu and a lot on Hawaii Island. And that reflects the large number of groups that are doing this work on the ground and the number of marine areas there. Maui and Kauai were pretty small. Kauai was, I would say, relative representative of what's going on there, so it should have been relatively small. Maui was just a timing situation, so this was right after the Lahaina fires, and then DAR was running a very large rulemaking process on Maui while I was running this project, so I didn't necessarily double tap people who were already doing a lot of work with DAR. So Maui could have been a little bit better, but there's still time for them to weigh in. Okay, so to the question of what do people even mean when they say adaptive management, and how do we start to find some synergies or where the tensions are there? I was able to code my interviews and sort them into 5 different definitions, and I'm not going to drag you through all of those definitions. I just want to point out how many different ways people are thinking about this. 2 that are notable are sometimes you say adaptive management, and because that new law just came through, everyone thinks you're just thinking about that one law. And so they think it means actually a no-take or a moratorium on the fishery. Another that's interesting is structured decision making. So if you talk to a scientist or too many in government, they will think of it in terms of a very structured, iterative process of testing out different management techniques, evaluating them, and then changing them. And then for a lot of the communities, adaptive management just means indigenous lifeways. So to be adaptive was and is inherent to cultural practices around fisheries management. And so when we talk about adaptive management, particularly at a community level, it's really very intertwined with talking about ways of life and ways of caring for place. So just to highlight a few of the hopes and concerns that came out of these interviews. It was very hard to talk about what people wanted for adaptive management without hearing everything that was frustrating about fisheries management in general. So I just want to honor that and highlight a few things that were brought up. One is that nearshore systems are very complex. We're dealing with a lot of different fish species, coral species, stressors coming off of like Malca sources. And so figuring out what's causing increases or decreases in fisheries and how to respond is really challenging. We have limited data and knowledge. We have very well studied reefs, but at the same time, that knowledge is not always available to everyone, or we don't have data structured to answer the questions that we need to answer. In general, there's limited capacity at the community and government level for both doing the monitoring of what's happening on the reef and doing the rulemaking process, because it's a long process, and I'll show it to you in a second. And then just generally, it's very contentious. So to work in the fishery space is to work across a number of different stakeholders who do not always get along with each other or have the same view on what should be happening in fisheries management. And that includes really different social norms around the scale at which decisions should be made. So do we want statewide rules? Do we want island-wide rules? Or do we want really place-based specific rules, which is a little bit more in line with how management happened here historically. So the other thing that was interesting coming into a conversation about adaptive management is a lot of people responded to that question by saying, well, actually, sometimes it's good for things to be stable. It's easier to follow rules if you know what they are and they don't change. It's easier to enforce them. Although I talked to some enforcement officers who said they didn't actually mind either way whether rules change. So that was kind of an interesting finding. Again, there's limited capacity to change the rules, so going through all those steps is hard for state actors. For commercial fisheries in particular, knowing what your limits are going to be year to year can help you predict what your catch and your income levels will be. So there's there were commercial fishers who wanted adaptive, flexible approaches, and there was also times when they said, no, just keep it the same, it's easier to deal with that way. And maybe from a more environmental perspective, in places that hadn't previously been protected or had rules in place, those rules took a lot of effort to put in place. So if you make it too easy to remove them, they're going to have to do that work all over again. On the other hand, there's still a value for flexible rules. We talked about a lot of this, but it came out in the interviews as well. So if rules don't ever change, that's really frustrating. If you have a rule that says, hey, you're not allowed to take, fish from this area, but you see that that fish is doing really well, as a fisher, you would like to be able to take a bit more for subsistence or commercial purposes. Same thing, if a fishery seemed like it was doing fine and then it crashes and you can't respond to that to protect it quickly enough, also frustrating. Gonna speed up a little bit so we have time for discussion. And then a few things that came out of interviews were just a lot of examples of what is changing on reefs. So outbreaks of invasive species, water quality decline, fluctuations in OPH and fish species spawning times, and a lot of ideas about responses. So communities especially emphasize that not all actions are about rules. Sometimes it's just education or asking people to adopt best practices. There is a desire to be able to adjust bag limits based on population size. So what I was just saying about if you see an increase or decrease, you would want your fisheries limits to respond accordingly. And then being able to adjust spawning closures from year to year. And then lastly, there was a lot of ideas about maybe we could just try out rules and then sunset them after 2 years or 3-year periods if we decide that they're not working well. Okay. I will take you briefly through the rulemaking pathways. You do not have to memorize them or know all the details, but it's good to know that they exist if you want to work in natural resource management or conservation. So there are 3. There's the regular rulemaking, the Chapter 91 that we talked about earlier. There's the new adaptive authority rulemaking or adaptive management law. And then there's emergency rulemaking. And just some highlights about how to think about these. Regular rulemaking is the slowest. It takes an absolute minimum of 6 months. It usually takes 2 to sometimes 10 years to get through that process because there's so much public input and back and forth. The adaptive authority is much faster. That's 47 days-ish. It's usually less than 2 months. And emergency rulemaking happens in about 2 weeks. So when it comes then to how long a rule lasts, the one that takes the longest to get the rule in place is the one that has the rule last the longest. Same for adaptive authority, medium amount of time, medium lasting about 2 years. And then emergency rulemaking is the fastest, and so it's also the shortest sunset, lasting only 3 months. There are different triggers for when you can use each. This is the broadest one. Anything related to management, you can do rulemaking, regular rulemaking. For the adaptive authority, it's only in response to changing conditions or new data or new technology. And in emergency rulemaking, you have to prove that there's imminent peril to the resource, which is a pretty high threshold. You have to say, if we don't take an action right now, this fishery is going to crash. And those just list the types of rules you can make across each of them. The only one that has limits is the adaptive authority, but it includes a lot. You can still do bag limits, size limits, and seasons. So knowing all 3 of these exist is a starting point. A lot of people don't know that those 3 options exist. They only are familiar with regular rulemaking. But the next question is, well, when do you want to use which? What are the strengths and limitations of each one? And I'm going to show you the processes. Don't try to read the whole thing. The point here is just that it's long. So this is regular rulemaking. You can see it's 10 steps. And in these steps, there's public announcements being made or public hearings being held. There are 3 places for public input, and there are 2 places where, based on public input, you can get sent all the way back to the beginning of the process. So you can see why this could take a long time. In asking participants about how this goes for them when they try to get rules through this process, They appreciated that it allows for public input and adjustments. They appreciated that sometimes you can write like a regular review of your rule into those into the rules that go through that process. So you could say, after 10 years, these rules sunset, and we'll try to put something new in place before then. And then again, it creates stable rules. For those who want stable rules, it's a great process. Limitations, it's very slow, it's very political. Every time there's an opportunity for public input, there are all those tensions that arise between stakeholders that come to the surface. And what ends up going out in the final decision can be very different than where the process started. So that can be very frustrating for communities or for fishers, or well, for different types of fishers. Depending on, what you were hoping for going into it. Your input is still limited. You can only talk for 3 minutes when you go through these rulemaking hearings. And the steps are confusing and hard to track for the general public, as you can imagine from looking at that chart earlier. And so in some, the permanence of those rules makes it difficult to improve on them. So again, don't worry about the steps here, but just to point this out, moving into emergency rulemaking, you can see how many steps are skipped. So instead of 10, there's 6, and the opportunity for public input is only once towards the end of the process. If a rule goes through emergency rulemaking, it is unlikely that it gets bounced back, but it's possible that it could. So reflections on this. So the one time this was used was for a sea cucumber or lowly ban across all of the islands after a harvest started on Maui and in Waimanalo in 2015. So what happened here is there is a Pacific-wide industry that exports sea cucumbers, usually to Asia, up and down the coast. And it's a very lucrative industry and it can take off fast. It had never come here. But it did in 2015, and so people on Maui and in Waimanalo saw people harvesting like literal truckloads of sea cucumbers. I don't know if anyone was paying attention to remember that, but it was very visually obvious to communities, and people were drawing these sea cucumbers in their backyards, in neighborhoods, and so it was very apparent that something was happening. So what's interesting about this timeline, and again, we don't need to go through all of the details, but we noticed the problem in May, and by the end of June, an emergency rule was put in place. So where the regular rulemaking process would have taken more than 6 months, probably more than a year, that happened in 2 months. While this was, so they put a full-on ban and just said, nobody can take these until we figure out how we want to manage sea cucumber, because Hawaii previous to that didn't have any rules in place. While that ban was in place, they went through full regular rulemaking. And that took about 6 months, which is probably the fastest we've ever gotten through that process. So for those who were interviewed, who were part of this process, there were probably only, I think there was about 12 people who still remembered the details of this. They saw this as a successful mechanism because there were few users affected, so there weren't a lot of fishers who were taking. The impact was very visible, so there was public support for action. And so you can conclude from that, if the impact is severe, the number of users impacted is low, and the controversy is therefore low, it's easier to use the emergency mechanism. The weaknesses is that even in that process, there was a lot of distrust for what data and knowledge went into that decision. So fishers were still questioning, was that really the right decision to ban it entirely? There was also some unintended consequences and confusion over how quickly that happened, because everyone was used to rules being very slow. There were some fishers impacted that just would harvest slowly for their family purposes, and they were no longer allowed to take during that time. So to improve, it's probably worthwhile to seek feedback from fishers, even if it's very short period to do that, just to figure out if there's any potential unintended consequences. And by fishers, I mean broadly all types of fishers, just for definition purposes. So commercial, subsistence, cultural practices. And then lastly, again, here's the adaptive authority rulemaking, very similar to emergency, except that it takes a little bit longer to go through. There's an opportunity for public input that's a little bit more substantive. takes about 47 days in practice to get a rule through this process, but it sunsets after 2 years. So the one time this has been used was for Pakui Kui, or the Achilles tang on Big Island, West Hawaii. This was a fish that is targeted for food purposes, but also for aquarium trade. And so there has been some concern over it for really over more than a decade about the population numbers that we're seeing. So West Hawaii has some protected areas specifically where aquarium take is not allowed for this species and several others. And unlike other species, this species was not seen to recover after those areas were put in place. And so after many reports showing concern for this species, but not very much action taken, with the passage of that adaptive management law, DAR decided to try a 2-year moratorium and just say, nobody take this fish for 2 years. We will try to figure out what's going on and then figure out what the longer term rule should be. So just to highlight that, and sorry, the colors are a little off here. This actually started in November. Well, it started in October, and by December, there was a rule in place. So again, quick action. And I know that seems very bureaucratic and administrative and technical, but that's very meaningful for communities that care a lot about their fisheries and want to be able to act quickly. And previously, there was no way for them to do that unless it was a real emergency. So that's the public notice point. Went through quickly. While those 2 years were going on, while there was a closure, they went through that regular rulemaking to replace it with a permanent rule. So just some reflections from participants on strengths and weaknesses here. Strengths, there was an ability to move quickly after many years of inaction. There was at least one round of public input allowed, and then a sunset of 2 years. So there was a bit of check on that power. So you can imagine if you didn't trust whatever action the state had made, the fact that it sunsets after 2 years is a way to balance that out and say, you know, we didn't give you as much opportunity for public input as we might have otherwise, but at least it's not going to last forever. Also, everyone now thinks that the adaptive management law is only about moratoriums, so that's a bit of a public communication issue. It's not. It can be used for any kind of rule, and including loosening rules, if there's rapid change, new data, or new technology. So, for example, this is just hypothetical, but if a community wanted to, say, adjust the moi spawning period for their island for a given year, they could use this authority in theory to say this year only the spawning period will be from, you know, I don't know what it would be, but from June to October instead of from May to November. So just a note for being aware that this rule is not just a moratorium option. Weaknesses, unlike the lowly, there was a lot more disagreement across subsistence, commercial, and government professionals on what was going on with this particular fishery. And so there was mixed support for that moratorium. It did end up going through. There was again confusion of the process. How did this happen so fast? When it's usually such a long process. And then if you really want to monitor and evaluate a species, it's hard to do that in 2 years. Okay, so like with the emergency rulemaking, if there was more venues to gather data and fisheries knowledge, even as you're going through that faster process, for example, through advisory committees or other ways of fishers and community stewards and others weighing in on the process, that might help to have a rule that is more accepted and more appropriate for place. Just gonna speed up so we can finish up, but yeah, rules implemented in that stopgap measure kind of need more than 2 years to figure out what's really going on. So that's still kind of a challenge here. Okay, so to wrap this up so we can get to discussion. There's a couple key takeaways here. So again, we're looking at what are the opportunities and limits of these available legal tools in practice for supporting collaborative adaptive management in a democratic context. The opportunities is we have 3 rulemaking options. We only really have used one extensively. We could use that in new ways. So the regular rulemaking process could be used in new ways to build in more flexibility, such as saying, maybe by board decision or community and DAR decision, we will revisit this bag limit every 5 years, just a hypothetical example. There is a lot of momentum around developing an adaptive approach that's super important in the context of climate change and in the context of trying to realize cultural practices fully, such as rotating hapu systems or rotating closures. There is a lot of adaptive actions that were raised through interviews that communities historically have been told or had felt they were not able to do in practice. And it actually is legally possible to do these things. It's just a matter of setting up the right knowledge processes to bring the right decision makers to, like, the right knowledge holders to that decision space, and building the capacity of both the state and the communities to get through those rulemaking processes. But it's not that we can't do it legally in most cases. Limits, again, people are thinking about this in different ways, so that needs to be clarified every time you would try to have a conversation about this. Not all rules need to be flexible, which we talked about earlier. And there's definitely clear trade-offs here between public input and trust building and speed. So the faster and more adaptive you are, the risk of lowering public input and trust becomes higher. And so depending on the situation, the place, the species, you might want to strike that balance differently. Okay, on the practice side, since there's a room full of students who might be interested in some of this work, developing the capacity and the right steps for transparent decision making that considers all those different trade-offs would be very valuable, and is something that is actively being worked on. Developing data and knowledge processes alongside those decision processes would also be helpful. So if you want to bring multiple sources of knowledge into the decision-making processes for any of these rules, so for example, considering cultural practice or considering Fisheries observations and also considering more like quantitative monitoring, there needs to be a process by which to do that, and that can take time to develop properly. So it's not just that we need to gather the information, it's that we need to create the process by which that information is gathered. So in terms of future applied research, it would be really helpful to contribute towards building these processes with communities and with government. So for example, pick an adaptive action that communities or others want to try and work through what it would look like to actually realize that in rulemaking. So in conclusion, just kind of broader picture for democratic context and fisheries management. Being aware that there's multiple rulemaking options and that they could be used in different ways is important, and should not be assumed unless you have someone who's going to drone at you for 45 minutes about it, like I am. It's important to just kind of check out what the opportunities are. Evolving legal options to consider the trade-offs between flexibility and stability. So think carefully when you go to change a process. So right now we're talking about not just one rule being different, but how you would go about making rulemaking itself more flexible, and there could be unintended negative consequences when you change a system and not just one particular situation. So you wouldn't, for example, want to make it too easy to change rules based on poor information sources. And then just an overview, developing the knowledge process alongside the policy decision process is super important to do simultaneously. And that means building relationships across policy research and indigenous and local communities. So this all happens, whether it's government, NGO, or community, through people. And so it's through our networks and through the relationships that we have that we can develop these processes better, rather than everyone staying in their particular silo. And just overall, again, I know it can feel very administrative or back end, but it's super important if we're going to be able to change as climate changes and as our fisheries and our coral reefs change. So thanks for your attention. And to all the participants in this study, of whom there are many, to DAR for their help, and especially their legal team for their help with all of those policy processes, to KUA and all the communities that hosted me for interviews. And then to my mentors who were Jet Kittinger with Conservation International and ASU, Luna Kekoa at DAR, and Kevin Chang with KUA. And then a number of interns and research aides who contributed pieces to this project. And to the ASU admin team who dealt with me being here all the time and them being all the way in Phoenix. And then thank you to the Smith Fellows Program who funded the research and really valued an applied approach that allowed me to be flexible and not just have to stick to specific objectives regardless of what my partners wanted.